Park Community Center. And we had good participation from the community. Matter of fact, it was great participation from the community. Diverse members of the community showed up, and our staff and our board members were there to lead the discussion, the forum on use of force. Now, what we heard was a number of things, a number of great ideas, a number of opinions, one of which came from members of the community that had serious concerns about the force that is being used on community members in Nashville, Davidson County. And so what I took away from that meeting was these ideas and these suggestions, the meat of this report must be conveyed to our new mayoral administration. These facts that are presented within the use of force report, they must be held up for not just the Community Oversight Board, not just for MNPD, but for every resident and every citizen in Nashville. And so what we took away from it is that it shouldn't just stay in the Community Oversight Board's room or our purview. This needs to go to the halls of City Hall. It needs to permeate within the mayor's office. It needs to be addressed at every level of city, government, and state government for that matter. So what we saw was an engaged community, but what became even more apparent is the work of the Community Oversight Board is not finished. We have unfinished business. And so not only are we going to work and finish the cases that we have in front of us and the work that we have in front of us until October 27, 2023, but it will exceed that date. Because what we found on August 15th is that 7 members have been selected to continue the work. But it does not negate the fact that we've had many members of this board work tirelessly to ensure that the people of Davidson County had a fair and transparent system of policing and community interaction, and it has happened up until this very day. And so what I want to encourage us is to keep up that work, to continue on with the unfinished business that we have, but also I want to take this time to thank the members of the Community Oversight Board for all of your hard work, those who are present now and those who have worked on the board and have been a part of this board since its inception. This is not easy work. This is not work to be taken lightly. People come to us and trust us to listen, to take their voices seriously, and take their concerns to the right people so right policy can be made, so people can understand their point of view when it comes to the community and the police. So what we want to do is continue the work. But I also want to highlight that this use of force report that we're talking about, that everyone is interested in, that they want to know what's going to happen with this information. The recommendations that have been put out, the recommendations that we have laid out will not go unheard. And I also like to point out that we have some more reports that will be coming out, one of which is sexual misconduct. So I'd like for everyone to stay engaged, to stay with the Community Oversight Board, to understand that the work that we're doing right now is just as important as it was when we first started. So be on the lookout. The work is undone, and we are not finished. We have a lot more to do. So thank you. And we will now move on to our Executive Director's report. Director Fitcher.
Thank you. I'm going to cover some points. Appreciate your chair remarks. You covered some of the things that I was going to just highlight on, and I will just kind of like add a little extra to certain things. I would like to congratulate the 7 members who were selected for the new reconstituted Community Review Board, and also thank the members who have spent the last 1, 2, and 3 years with us. That would be Member Michaela McCree, Member Spencer, and Member Turner, whose term will end October the 27th. So we thank you for your service and your diligence and just everything that you brought to us in this community. We appreciate you. And also congratulate those 7 members who are staying on for staggered terms. That's Alicia Haddock, Drew Goddard, Joe Brown, Mark Wynn, Mary Beard, Sean Witzel, and Walter Holloway. Thank you for your continued service to the community in this way. And those will be staggered terms. I don't know them offhand, but I'm sure we can get that information if you don't know it. But thank you again for that selection, and to the mayor for selecting and keeping our board, the continuity of our board. I will say that we had an executive committee meeting on Wednesday, August the 23rd. Our next monthly board meeting will be held in the community, and it will be at the Bellevue Regional Community Center, and that'll be on September the 25th. There's a department head meeting Thursday, August 31st, and Mr. Kiley will sit in because I will be on vacation, and so he'll take care of that and bring back any information that the administration, I think it's their closeout meeting that we have that is pertinent to the work that we do. And then also for this month with the complaints, we've received 17 complaints. 5 ended up with open investigations. And so the number, I will say the number is rising. We're getting a whole lot more calls. I hadn't really kind of broke it down like this before. I usually just tell you how many we have open, not how many we necessarily send to other jurisdictions or send to OPA or send other places, but we had 17 this month. Also, there's been a total, I think we got an increase in calls. We had 79 complaint contact calls. Some of those are when intake is processing the calls to determine whether or not it's a case that we can even pursue. We get some complaints that some people are just venting. It doesn't necessarily move forward in opening up an investigation. We also have had 13 dispositions issued this month. And we had 2 requests for police records. I will say that kind of deviating from last month, the police department has sent some records. Did they send video as well? No video, but some records.
They've sent some personnel records.
So we still aren't getting the kind of records that we need to move forward in our investigation. So just to let you guys know that. I know that A.D. Kiley was working with MNPD, contacting them and Metro Legal regarding how we can continue to get our records. And I think it's just going to boil down to an MOU agreement. And I did reach out to the chief, Chief Drake, and requested a meeting so that we could discuss not only an MOU, but like how we go about continuing to get the records that we need now so that we can close cases out in October. So that's ongoing. I haven't heard back from him. We requested the date, and he said that he would have his person reach out to us and give us a date. Well, we haven't received that yet. So I'm assuming that's going to come sometime this week. I won't be in, but I'll make certain that A.D. Kiley gets that information and passes it along to you, Chair. We're going to have 3 PRs this month, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. It's been a pretty busy month with just with the reconstitution, but also just making certain that we are continuously spreading the word that we are not abolished and that we're still doing this work. It might look different slightly. We're hoping that it doesn't change too much. The functionality of what we do, looking at other departments across the state as well as across the country to determine how we can create the most robust civilian oversight board or review board as possible. And so we've met with community organizations this month. In the month of August, it was a roller coaster with the LPR. We spent a lot of time, myself, especially the staff, working with the council and other organizations to talk about, especially Turk and some others, in regard to, their opposition to license plate readers. And so just kind of giving them factual information. Myself and Dylan DePriest did a presentation along with the police department, as well as the DA's office and the public defender, to the Metro Council before the vote was taken, talking about what that informational report released for that pilot program, making certain that we had enough facts and information, statistical information, to share with not only the council, but with the community. And there was a great deal of, I think, people were organizing around the fact that they were opposed to license plate readers, and not only based on the information that was contained in our report, but just from information that they have themselves researched and found out, especially as it pertains to ICE and immigration. And so that information was presented to the council. They sent over, I think, approximately 30 questions to get from our staff, who worked really diligently to get that information to them, I guess, for them to make some, the information they needed before they made this decision to move forward with a permanent license plate reader program here in our city. We did ask, myself and A.D. Kiley did speak to the council in regard to making certain that we were involved in at least the auditing process and the selection process. We had talked to people in procurement who said that they couldn't give us the information, that it was, they had all these I'm not gonna say secretive, but I'm gonna say they had things around the procurement process. I think that wasn't as transparent as we would have liked it to be, and we just kind of wanted to insert ourselves in the process of, at least with the selection of vendors, that somebody's at the table that's not just the police department, asking questions of vendors about how this process works and who gets the information, how it's kept. During that process, we found out that there was a new technology that the police department purchased back last year in September for $175,000. It's called Fusus. Fusus is, I'm not going to get too deep into it. I'll let Dave talk a little bit about it in a second. But Fusus is this new technology that, so they did a single source bid on it, was able to get it, which did not, at that point, it did not kind of trigger having to go before the whole council. And so, what we did was, when we found out about it, we reached out to Electronic Frontier to find out, because they deal with all this kind of technology, to get more information about it. And they called us, talked to us about it. Dave has, reached out to the police department about it. But once it triggered, once the 6 months was up, and they wanted to move forward with their program or get more. So they received 58 of those units. 50 they sent to businesses, 8 they kept themselves. It attaches itself to cameras, and I'll let Dave explain a little bit more about it. But anyway, when they went to get more, to purchase more, that second purchase triggered a response from the council. And so, because of what I learned from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and then just what my staff was able to produce, it really was alarming to me. And so, because of that, and the information that I was gathered, I made the decision to reach out to Councilmember Syracuse and asked him to defer that until we could have more information and discussion around it, because I don't think anyone no one had a discussion on it. No one in the community knew about it. Dave, you want to tell them a little bit about Fusus?
Yeah, and I don't know a ton about it, but their website is pretty opaque. It doesn't give you a lot of information, but basically they sell these small boxes which range from like $200 up into the thousands. And what you do is you plug that into the back end. Say I have a Ring camera system, or I run Bridgestone, right? Either way, you've got a small surveillance system or a big surveillance system. You run that through a Fusus box, which then connects it to the police department. I think, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, but what the company refers to that as is technology agnostic, meaning, as I understand it, any format of video can run through that box and then it gets fed to the police department. So based on the user's settings, they can give the police either no access or some access, like, you have to ask me if you want to see my video, or the user can give the police department just unfettered 24/7 live streaming of their cameras, which an officer could look at on like a cell phone. So some of the concerns I know that we had from EFF were that, what is this doing? I also spoke to a friend, colleague out in Silicon Valley who he could only explain it by saying this is basically a hacking device. Anything you run through it is decrypting and de-encoding that information and then re-encoding it so that it can be sent into this, so that it can be seen in this overarching system. So that's what we know right now. I know that the research team is preparing a short informational report about it. So that's the best information we have at this time. The police haven't told us much else. This morning, or actually on Friday, they did send over some of the contract information about it that I'm going to take a look at and just kind of see about the process and everything. But it's pretty alarming stuff, I think is fair to say.
And I asked Dave, we talked about it, and he sent over some information to the police department that asked a bunch of questions so that we could at least have some foundational information as we begin to study it a little bit more. So,
and they did respond to that. So
yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. So that's, let me see if there's anything. Oh, a couple other things. We do have a bunch of community events coming up in the next few months. I will say that our community liaison, she has reached out to the schools because, of course, there's a lot going on with SROs in schools. And so I think it's important, especially since she was a teacher for 9 years, that and she has those relationships within the metro schools, that we are sharing our information with children in the high schools. And so they have different programs, and they have invited us in to talk about that. I will say that the NACO's annual conference is going to be amazing this year. It's November 12th to the 16th, and some of our staff will be going. I am a presenter. I was contacted by one of the presenters there, and they are presenting on state preemption and asked me to be a panelist on that. And then I also was selected with another group, some from Denver and California, to do the webinar conference in December of 2023. And I think maybe our research team also is going to be presenting at the webinar. Yeah. And so we'll talk a little bit about that because I'm not sure what your title is yet. But anyway, so they'll be presenting as well. So both of us from Nashville will be presenting on in the December conference. So that's online. And so I'm also a guest speaker at the Black Tennessee Voices Storytellers, which will be on September the 21st. And that is, if you guys want more information, I put the information here, but I can give you more information on that. I would love for you all to be in the audience and support. I'm a little nervous about it, but thank you. And the chair kind of helped me through this process. So thank you very much. I appreciate your help. And so as the Police Academy, if you haven't went to the Police Academy, whoever's new, you will have to do that. And I'll send you, I think the only person it would be is a member board. I'll send you that information today. It is a very long process. It's 11 weeks, and I think it's on a Tuesday, every Tuesday. It might be Wednesday, I don't know, whatever, but it's one of those days. I'll send you the information. I just, so we also have a couple staff on there. And so we've been working really hard, as I said, in our executive committee meeting for the reconstitution. My goal is to have us up and running with this reconstitution October 1. And so that we kind of are not waiting to the last minute to just start it. And so it'll be kind of like dual, still trying to close out cases, but also operate in this new thing. We have reached out to Metro HR. I think the first step was to make certain that the positions fell into the right civil service classifications, and trying to reclassify the names for some of the positions. Not all of the positions have to be changed, but of course, those who are functioning as full-time investigators, we have talked about what that name is and what we might reclassify them as, which is not something that's already in the Metro pay scale. So we'll have to sit down with them so that this will have to go before the Civil Service Board to make the determination. So I reached out. They are supposed to be getting back with me. They wanted to reach out to Metro Legal first to find out what some of the legal limitations or parameters around the positioning, and maybe just to get a clearer understanding of how the law and how it transforms into a position. And so we've worked as a staff with strategy planning sessions. I would like all of you to be involved coming up in the month of September to give your feedback on some of the information that we're going to be presenting to you. I'll reach out to you and give you the dates and times to see when it's flexible for you. So that as we build this up, it's not just us building it, it's all of us building it collectively and making it as robust as we can for the community so that we don't lose much of the work that we've been doing, and that the people know that we're still here. Obviously, some people think we're still here. We're getting all these calls. 70 calls, that was a lot. In 1 month. And then out of that, they were 17 complaints out of those 70 plus calls. And that's not even my calls. That's just calls into the intake line. And then plus out of that 5, what we think are legitimate complaints. So that stuff is moving forward. Like I said in the executive committee meeting, it is very hard to reconstitute on one end and not have the police department at the table on how we do this collectively. If we're sending complaints over to them, I mean, we got to have a plan. Like we need to have a conversation with OPA to determine how this process will work together. Because if we're the repository or the intake for these complaints, I mean, what do we do when we get them? If we're starting and they haven't had a conversation with us about it, it's very hard to make a lot of sense of it. So on how it will work. So we've got to work through that as well. And I think pretty much you saw the community outreach. We had a bunch of, really a lot of engagement this month. I didn't put everything down because each department within our agency is making, and reach out and talking to all of the people in the community and what it is that they do. I wanted to say that use of force public forum was amazing. Thank you. For being the chairperson of that. We appreciated it so much. And some of the information that came out, I think Member Beard brought up some good recommendations. So all of that was excellent. I will say the Nashville Bail Fund was represented, NOAA, Metro Human Relations Commission, the Nashville People's Budget, Open Table, and then just other people from the community. So I thought it was, as the chair said earlier, I thought it was it was a really robust conversation. People were really engaged, and they talked about the use of force. And I think one of the things that it sticks with me is the person from Open Table who represents the unhoused and how use of force is used on them, or if somebody calls the police on someone who's Black and brown and they're unhoused, that the likelihood that they would have an encounter or use of force encounter was escalated, I thought was something that we all should be concerned about and thinking about. And so I'll close with our office space. We did have a conversation with the property director and his team, just to kind of get some understanding of what happened with that. If you haven't been down on 2nd Avenue, you might not want to come, because it looks like a war zone in front of our building as they begin to change, I guess, the look, and they start at the top of the block all the way down to Broadway. And so right now they're working at the top of the block and to change it into this new, I think, whatever they want to call it. Like they have outdoor patio tables and they're changing the street and the sidewalks. But right now the streets are closed to pedestrian, foot traffic. And you have to enter in on the 1st Avenue side. So it has been challenging, not only for us as, people who work in the Washington Square building, but just for the businesses around as well. Like the hotel across the street, is it even still in business?
It changed name.
Oh, okay. Well, the people there, I mean, it's been a lot, and it won't be finished until sometime next year. And so I wanted him to understand that, because he may not have seen how how the street has changed. But he said that they were looking for us to find a new place. They're looking to find us a new place, as well as MAC and social services. And what happened was that MAC and social services did not like the location or didn't fit what they needed. And so they kind of are still in their same places, and that it's cheaper for the city if people are kind of on the same lease and grouped together for the build out costs. And so just trying to find a great location. I will say that MAC and social services has very specific and special needs that we don't have. And I wanted to make certain that he understood that, like, we don't run a food pantry. We don't need refrigeration. We don't need a docking area where big trucks come in. And so, you know, we just need an office space that has parking. And so, and that's nice and, you know, and somewhat private. So I don't know. I mean, I did voice those concerns because they may be anywhere, you know, because they need like a freight area that we will never need. So that's going to be challenging, I think. I don't think it's going to be that challenging because we saw a couple spaces that we really liked. It just will be that they may not be on the lease with those two agencies. So we'll see what that looks like. And so that concludes my executive director's report. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Member Wynn?
Thank you, Director Pritchard. It just occurred to me, the Hickory Hollow Mall, where the district we're all in, it just announced a major project to take the mall and make it into more of a community access center. I didn't know whether, and the parking's nice.
Yeah.
I didn't know whether that was an area that you all considered.
Well, they had mentioned not Hickory Hollow, but Metro Southeast initially, but Metro Southeast didn't really have a really great bus line. And so when I think about going all the way out to Hickory Hollow, I think that the people that may live further on this side of downtown would have a little harder time to get there, especially with traffic on 24. And I think a more centralized area, I think, is the Metro Center area. I think that's pretty much going to still kind of leave you downtown. It kind of is it's not too far from the bus station itself. And I think it's more like centralized and neutral for anyone to get there without, but we'll see. Thank you.
Member Witzel?
Yeah. Thank you for that report. Question about, we were talking earlier in the report about getting the word out that we have not been abolished. I'm curious to know what questions people have asked or what those conversations have looked like.
Yeah, I mean, most of it is, we thought you were abolished. You know, that's what they always say. We didn't think you guys were around anymore. And so you have to do some education. I think it's going to take a whole lot of education because I think it's, you know, you start talking about state preemption and things like that, people aren't going to get that. But just like how we have had to change and what does that mean for them? I mean, when you start talking about bringing in OPA into the equation of how we do things, I think it's automatically something that people, you know, I'm not going to say they always have an adverse reaction to it, but they always are a little more concerned about it. And so that's basically been it. I thought you were abolished. That's what they felt like the news was reporting. And, you know, we're saying, no, we're still around. We just will be doing things slightly different. I mean, and don't, you know, like, I know that Metro Legal has taken a really conservative stance saying that we can't investigate anything. But I don't think that that's what the law or the actual ordinance states. You know, also, I think that Knoxville is doing something completely different. And so if we're going to follow this Knoxville model, then we need to look and see what Knoxville is actually doing. But we want to educate the public more. We want to have going forward, have some listening sessions, some educational sessions. I have a few I think there are lunch and learns coming up that Ms. Robinson has scheduled for me to share with different communities. And of course, I said, like, with the schools as well. So, yeah.
Question.
Okay.
You mentioned with the Community Review Board getting started on that October 1st. Mm-hmm. Do you see the potential of any reason that there would be more than one board meeting that month, just because of overlap to close things out and.
Well, not necessarily board meetings, maybe like, committee meetings, or just like a special call meeting. I was going to check with Sarah in regards to how we would, like, have an education meeting is, I don't know, I'm assuming if we have more than, if we're not going to deliberate on certain things and we're just having a planning session, I don't know what that looks like because it could just be in the office. Can you all come to the office and let's just do a regular strategy planning meeting about like what this reconstitution looks like without having a full scale meeting like public? I don't know. So we've got to get that worked out. I recall that we've had something like that in the past. When we were just strategizing, not necessarily coming to something and deliberating on it, that we could have those meetings without having a special call meeting, for instance. So I'm going to find out and get you some more information on that because we'd like to do that in September, a couple of those.
Member Holloway.
Oh, you're talking about having a strategized meeting and maybe come in the office. It would be nice if that strategized meeting was in a place like the Lens Health Center.
Yep, we can do that.
Easy park, better parking area,
Right. Well, yeah, not in the office, but we do have some free parking, but you're right. I think we do need to have it somewhere else. Absolutely.
And also, we got a new mayor going to be elected in a few days. And we need a personal rapport with him so that he can kind of help lead the way and understand where we're coming from and by him on the same page with us and he have a good rapport with us to send a message out to the community as well that he is in support of us.
Thank you.
Yeah. You didn't say he or she. Thank you. As a matter of fact, we did discuss that at the executive committee meeting with the two candidates for mayor as soon as possible. Member Goddard.
It occurs to me, asking questions more than saying something I think needs to happen. The new board, as a matter of law, I don't think will have any committees, any bylaws, any rules, any officers. So we may want to have, hopefully would be a fairly short meeting to address those kinds of things short on or shortly after the 27th. Just throw that out.
In the 27th of October?
Oh, October, yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Can't do it before then.
Right.
Member McCree.
Thank you, Chair. Just a brief question surrounding the work being done with MMPS, the SRO program that could or could not happen depending on what the governor's plan looks like. That's an area of concern that I still will be working in much long after I'm a board member. And so I want to know if there is a future of not only working with the schools, but what does oversight in that area look like? This is not an area where investigation may be necessary, but having data around what school resource officers actually looks like when we invest in those programs in urban areas, how it affects our kids, and more so with the threat of public safety being a conversation around school shootings and what that looks like for our children. What does it actually mitigate harm? I think there's a lot of confusing conversations about the fact that school resource officers prevent tragic events like that happening, and the data doesn't show that. And so if there was some real numbers and real reports that came out of this board, that would be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think that if you looked at the use of force report, after they were able to put all of that information and aggregate it and create this report, there was some things that were concerning, whether it be K-9 usage, whether it be the cost that misconduct cost our city, and then of course, this violence, police violence against children that, we're finishing up the reports that we have now, and then they will start working. I think that we can parse out some of the different reports with that kind of information that you're talking about, the data, what it shows in regards to having police officers in schools. And so I think that's an upcoming informational report. Yeah, and we want to continue to do that. I mean, at this point, that there is a lot of talk about SROs. There's lots of funding for them. There's lots of debate around whether they're necessary and whether the schools want them or whether the state legislator wants them. And so, and I think I am on I've been invited for a national conference to talk about, youth justice and that. And I think that's going to be in October here in Nashville. I'll make sure you got the information. But I do think it's important that when you say oversight, that kind of, I don't know exactly what that looks like for us. And I don't know how much, I think it's fair that we need to sit down with MNPS to talk about what is happening. What if a child's parents make a complaint? How would we, what part of this do we play in? Because we can still take in those complaints. And do we take complaints from young people, right? The juveniles, and their representative. And, so I don't know yet. That's a tough question for us because where we have somewhat of oversight here, this new ordinance doesn't give us the same kind of oversight in the way that we're used to doing it.
Absolutely, and I know that's a tough question for where we are right now. But I would love to see this board and for the staff to be a part of the conversation moving forward in leadership of it in a similar way that we were with LPRs. And I think that's something that is possible to do so.
Okay.
I'm excited for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, I think, you really brought up a good point because what our report highlighted was, force was used against youth and 96% of those youth were Black and 58% of those Black youth were girls, right? Females. And so it would be, almost irresponsible to not see the work through, if you know what I mean. And that brings us to a good portion of your report, Director Fitchard, because at this point with, us revising the work, reconstituting the work, it leaves space for the Community Oversight Board to be a part of Nashville's overall public safety plan. And not just play in this space of only investigations or only, policy review, but what does public safety look like for Nashvillians from the perspective of the community and not just the government? So not a top-down public safety plan, but a bottom-up approach, right? And so I think the Community Oversight Board is particularly poised to be a part, be a robust part of what public safety looks like for Nashville. And that goes from the community to the schools, right? And every public institution that we find ourselves in. Our children, we just had a rough first part of the year with the Covenant shooting. And so every child matters, right? It doesn't matter what school you're in, if you're in parochial school or you're in public school, and you have to interact with an SRO. What does that look like, right? For children of all colors, all hues, all classes. And so I think we are game and able to take part in those conversations. So I think, if we are talking about Member Holloway, our engagement with the new mayoral administration, that should be top of the conversation. Director Fitchard, I wanted to go back to the LPR conversation just because it was highly contentious. I was there. You guys were on the hot seat, if you will, with that LPR report that was pretty darn good, if you ask me. But it passed overwhelmingly, I do believe, in council. Right, and there were a lot of community groups that were that had questions, and some of those questions were left unanswered. And what I want to kind of talk about is that fuses, and then the things that we don't know. right? So those unanswered questions that, we, the Community Oversight Board, our staff, we answered to the best of our ability, but some were just left out there, right? And so how can we ensure, the community that we will be right there with them as this LPR rollout happens? And then, in talking with our Metro Council and our, current or new administration that will be coming in, how can we be a part of those conversations as well? If it's auditing, if it's reviewing, really digging into what FUSES actually is. Because if you go on their website, I could not understand not one thing. It was very vague. And I think it was intentionally, set to be like that, right? And so what are your thoughts on moving forward, and how can we help empower the community? Because what we were left with was a great number of cameras, right? And predominantly communities of color and communities that have suffered poverty and are severely under-resourced. So as we kind of move forward, what does that look like for us?
Yeah, I mean, we had that discussion on the floor. I mean, I think that some of the council members, a few of them, was very proactive in trying to include us in the LPR discussion and the auditing and the aftermath of installation. And it seemed like, there was a lot of dancing around that, well, community groups are involved and community groups can come and talk to us. And they kept pushing and pushing for some really, I think, straight answers about what that looked like in real time with the community being involved and what times. And when the police department's response was basically that anybody's invited. We don't exclude anyone. But they were hesitant or just really, I wouldn't even call it hesitation. I just think that they did not want to include the CRB in that discussion and put it and codify it in the legislation. But simply was like, well, you guys can get involved in any way that you want. But that did not really that didn't leave us with having, I think, feeling like we were involved in a way that would really bring some significant accountability to this LPR program. And so the only thing that we do know for certain that was deferred indefinitely for future, at this point, for future finances was FUSES, when Councilmember Syracuse, basically deferred it indefinitely. Pretty suddenly. And so, as I said, we spoke with the woman who is a person that is working with FUSES. She works with like I said, with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She does the work of keeping up with FUSES, the research, and she's an expert in that. And so, I think that we're concerned about it. I think that there's a lot of people across the nation is concerned about it and what it opens the door to, which, as I've said multiple times, I am concerned about all of this technology, all of this surveillance technology becoming the starting point or the epicenter of facial recognition technology in our city. Because I do think that the more that you have, it begins the beginning of that process. The technology like they have now, it doesn't take much to turn that equipment into a facial recognition, to make the software into facial recognition software. Motorola, as well as, which is the WatchGuard that they use now, for the body cams and in-car cameras, they just need to do an update on their software. And so I just think that we need to be very diligent about that in holding the police department accountable for making decisions like they did with FUSES without any transparency and accountability of what this technology is and not having conversations with the public about it. It is alarming that they would have done that. And then when I talk to them, try to downplay it as if it isn't what we think it is and what we talk to experts who use it, what they have said about it. And so, did you want to add something about that?
All right, I was just going to add, there was a conversation at the council too about adding us into the procurement process, which I think would be a fantastic idea. That both Metro and MNPD and the council all seem to not be enthusiastic about, although I think that would be a very good idea so that we could keep closer tabs on this stuff. I will add just real quick on the facial recognition. They say, FUSA says we have not, never will use facial recognition technology. The big giant asterisk that I want to put next to that statement by them is that according to Electronic Frontier and just logic, you can still plug facial recognition into it. So it's not like you can't use it. And also, even without facial recognition, you are still talking about a mass surveillance system, a mass video surveillance system. And that is the conversation that needs to be had, because that is what is being built, or would be built with a widespread deployment.
And what we receive from Ms. Burrell is it says the model expands police access to personal information collected by private cameras that would otherwise require warrants and community conversation. Because these cameras are privately owned, police can enjoy their use without having to create and follow records retention and deletion policies. And so I do think that that's concerning. I think for me, I was a little more concerned. Not only I was very concerned about that, but secondly, I was concerned that license plate reader information has some very strict guidelines through the state and through our own surveillance technology policies that's embedded in our charter. And so my concern is that if a private person is giving that information and they can get that information and it runs through and comes to the police department, like who's holding them accountable to the 10-day retention rule? I don't know. And so those are some of the concerns that we have. And so I think that this will take some more research and work.
Yeah, I think, where this is heading, in the spirit of transparency, the Community Oversight Board will have to be involved in this LPR, the ongoing of the LPR technology and the inclusion of fuses. Finding out about it, many months later, and it was in connection with the LPR is quite concerning. So I would like to, for us to send a letter to council, and September 14th, we'll find out who will be our next mayor. And a letter to the new mayoral administration, stressing the point of our inclusion in that process for its duration. One more thing before we move on, because we do have 3 PRRs to review. And we have our 3 PRRs to review. Board Member Turner, just so you know. Office space. And getting to the office on 2nd Avenue is quite a feat. And how we are able to serve our clientele that will need to come to the office in their physical presence. And I think that is being downplayed, right? And put on the back burner, if you will, and we are not paying enough attention to ensuring that people have access to the Community Oversight Board physically. I have a car, right? I have the ability to walk, and it's even difficult for me to get to the office. So if someone with physical limitations or a lack of transportation or whatever that is trying to get to Washington Square is problematic. And we don't have to guess, we don't have to wonder what's going on with it. And I think more attention will need to be paid to that, and it will need to happen before that lease is up at the end of the year. And so just the inaccessibility of the office is really a top concern. Mm-hmm. So we did survive the reconstitution, or whatever you want to call it, the abolishing of, and what the state tried to do, but we're still here. But we need to make sure that people have access to the office. And so we probably need to restart that conversation again, and it is not finished.
Okay. I agree. It is tough.
It is. It's very tough. I mean, the middle of the street is in bits and pieces.
Right. I mean, people from that work across the street at the hotel just quit. I mean, it's just, it's very problematic. This morning, they let out the water. I don't know what it was, but it was a flood, basically. We couldn't get out the garage because the water, they were the little, I guess, made borders or whatever you want to call them. They let the water out because they were full, and it was, you had to wait till all this water ran down. It was just a lot going on. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll need to revisit that, and as well as the meeting with Chief Drake and MNPD, OPA, so we can begin to set the tone on what this will look like, regarding the work going forward. So the Chief Drake did reach out to you and say that he was going to have his assistant send you some dates.
Yeah, he said he was going to have someone send me some dates. Let me see when he did that. Hold on a second. That was sometime early last week. I knew that they were in a conference at some point. He tried to get us to talk to or meet with Deputy Chief Hagar, and then we went back and asked him that we wanted to meet with him. And then he did respond and said that would have been maybe last week that he would, he said that he would have his administration look and see, I guess, for some availability. I asked him would he had availability next week because I had already requested it a few weeks ago. So this was August the 23rd. So that was last week. And he said that he would check and see. And then she will respond when she's able to get it set up. And so that was on the 23rd.
And so we haven't received a response as of yet. Okay. All right. We'll follow up with them as well.
Yep.
Okay. All right. If there's nothing further, Member Brown.
I just had one comment. I know at our executive committee we discussed Commander Laura, but I noticed he is not here tonight, and I want to be sure he got an invitation. And he's been faithfully attending, but he's been notably absent the last two meetings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did not extend the invite to him. I forgot to do that, but I will make certain that I send him an invite shortly that he, for the next meetings to come.
He did not get a specific invite for this meeting?
I didn't send him one, no.
I thought at the executive committee we said be sure.
We did, but I will say that we did not disinvite him. And we did not tell him that, he was no longer welcome here. And so, Joe, I understand where you're coming from when we want to send him another invitation to come to the board meetings. But I can't understand why he stopped coming. I know. And so maybe that's something we should ask Chief Drake, since he is the one, running the show. Thank you. It's now time for public comment.
Anyone sign up?
I think we can move on from public comment. No public comment. We'll now move on to our proposed resolution reports.
So can you hear me okay? I got the mic here. The first one, I'm just going to go in chronological order, is 2021-016. This was actually, there we go. This was one that was presented to the board previously on December 12th, 2022, which was my first meeting, but I wasn't on staff yet. And I'll just quickly go over the summary of the allegations. Was that back on April 2nd, 2021, the complainant reported to MNCO that on March 25th, 2021, on Marina Street near McFerrin Park, the complainant saw a woman who reported to her that she had been the victim of a sexual assault. The complainant felt that the responding officer, Officer 1, was discourteous, unprofessional, and lacked the skill set to deal with a victim who had experienced trauma. Specifically, the complainant said she saw Officer 1 trying to help the victim walk, and when the victim fell, the officer proceeded to pick her up by the armpits and carry or drag her to the side of an ambulance. The complainant stated that she asked the officer whether the victim would receive support from an advocate at the hospital, and Officer 1 cut her off and said, quote, "We need to get a statement," and she's being very uncooperative. When the complainant sort of objected and said she's been raped, she's in shock, Officer 1 allegedly gave her an angry look and said, quote, "She's probably on something." Similar statements as the complainant tried to engage with the officer, where we're trying to do our jobs here. When we're done, she can get any counseling she wants, and telling the complainant at one point, "I know how to do my job, miss." And the board deliberated extensively, and just to jog your memory, it was mostly about whether to discipline this individual officer, but also whether or not to investigate the chain of command, training, policy, et cetera. And so in response to the board's directives, that is kind of, the research team is working in some facets on how sexual misconduct is handled in the department. We went back to this original report, and I directed one of the investigators to interview there were two sergeants implicated. Basically, we picked the one who arrived with the sex crimes detective, feeling that that was the most relevant one. Our investigator contacted that sergeant, who will just be referred to as Sergeant 1 for now, who is now assigned to the training section. We reached out to him on July 24th. Didn't get a response, reached out a second time on August 9th, and then on August 14th, Sergeant 1 responded and declined to be interviewed. Considering that all MNPD subject officers have similarly refused our interview request since July 1, 2023, and since the research team's sort of systemic look at this issue is ongoing, we thought it best to return it to the board at this point because it didn't seem productive to continue to dedicate investigative resources to it. So unfortunately, we have no further information for you from the chain of command regarding, whether or not this officer's actions were appropriate, inappropriate, within policy, without policy. So we would rely on the earlier conclusions that were presented with the PRR, which were that by a preponderance of the evidence, the allegations of discourtesy and conduct unbecoming should be sustained, but the allegation of deficient performance should be not sustained.
And just to be clear, that number is not correct. So that's just a mix up on the 2021, but that's not the case. We're covering right now 2021-16.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, did I give you the wrong number? I think I did.
Comments? Member Goddard.
My recollection, and that's a huge qualifier going back to December, so others that were there, please speak up. But my recollection was, and this may have just been my sense of the conversation, so please don't take it as God. My recollection was, some of us at least thought that the 4 days was too much or a bit much or something if he had not been trained on this subject. And if he had been trained, 4 days was fine. And that was part of that, and also seeing whether we need some direction to the chief with respect to training was clearly part of the research. And if we haven't been able to get any sense of that, particularly if we waited a number of months before asking, I'm a little uncomfortable sort of resolving that issue to the disfavor of the officer, saying 4 days. I would be comfortable with something less. I would be comfortable with a split that says if he received training, or if he didn't, something less, Chief, part of our recommendation is you determine whether he received training or not and make the decision accordingly. That may be way too many options for the group, but that's my thought after reading this.
Member Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to go back. What was the chief's response to this? I know it's, again, some time back. What was the chief's response to his reprimand, if there was one? I just don't recall.
To my knowledge, this was never sent to the chief because it wasn't, the report was returned to us. to do more investigation. And so we only send the completed PRRs to Chief Drake.
I'd be curious. I mean, so based on, I mean, so we have to conclude something for order for this to go to the chief, for him to make some type of statement or response to this. So that.
We could, I mean, and that's the thing. There are several, you do not have to vote on the discipline issue today. We could defer it. I'm not, I think the only way that we're really going to get an answer about that is either from y'all's meeting with the chief or from I know the research team's doing a lot of looking at kind of the structure of this, and I don't want to prematurely talk about what they've learned, but I do not anticipate any better response if we reach out to the training staff at the academy or to anyone else. I mean, they have not spoken to us since July 1 in terms of interviews. So,
I just, say, it's just very disappointing.
Yeah.
What the decline of the officers is very disappointing. Again, of the cooperation. So, it's out there. So I guess the public can see, the lack of response, so.
And
anyway,
the officer, I will say it's a small thing, but the officer said what I believe all of them have said, which was since he didn't get an order from the chief, he will not comply. So I don't want to put all that on him. This is a department-wide thing.
Member Beard, hold on, Member Beard. Member Holloway, did you have something? Then Member Beard, then Member. Go ahead.
In actuality, was she raped or not, and she said she raped, you treated like a rape. And that's why you got detectives for sexual abuse be called out. And it wasn't made known that it wasn't anybody on call or anybody available. So, as you could say, that out of his expertise, he should have first see if it was any sexual abuse detectives available and gone from there, but not to assume that her behavior may have a reflection on how she felt, how she was treated, or maybe she's just acting out of order more or less. You don't make that assumption. You be professional and see that she get the help that she needs.
I was just going to say, I don't know if you remember, but this is a young woman who's laying in the street. She is also, as she's giving him information, but he's all, the video is very disturbing. I'll say that. Questioning her, and then also, basically saying, "Were you drunk? Are you sure this happened?" This was very egregious. It was very, it didn't have any compassion in it. And then got very angry at the lady who was there as a complainant, saying that this is the work that I do. I think that you need to listen to what she's saying. And then, just kind of being very dismissive to a person who has worked with victims of rape and domestic violence. And so, I do think that our report, and they're going to report on it, the sexual misconduct investigation stuff, it's going to be super helpful. But that doesn't, negate the fact that this officer acted the way that he acted in almost re-traumatizing a victim.
Member Beard.
Thank you. I would just like to say that I'm on the Sexual Assault Center board as well. And when I read this particular PRR, it was very disturbing to me of how this woman was treated. I just sent earlier, last week, I sent an article from the New York Times about the concept of freezing. And it's a concept of when an individual has been sexually assaulted, that they actually freeze. They don't have a defense. They don't have words to say. It's like a concept in which you freeze, in which you can't defend yourself. or it was a concept that we see in war when actual officers would freeze when they had been hurt. So the assault person is coming by wouldn't try to hurt them some more, right? It's this frozen concept. And based on that article, my heart went out to her because she just froze. You know, she couldn't speak. She couldn't say, you know, exactly what happened. And that's what we need to think about when the police are dealing with individuals and you have a person that's telling you what that person has gone through or what they think that person has gone through. There is a concept in the law that talks about taking a person as you find them, right? You don't know what trauma they have already received. You don't know if she has been sexually assaulted or before. You don't know what kind of mental issues this person has. It's taking the person as you find them. And he did not seem to have compassion whatsoever for the condition that this person was in or any empathy, because his reaction to her trauma was that she's being difficult when she couldn't probably do any more than what she was doing. And I wasn't here in December of when this case was first heard, but me being on that board, my heart just went out to this individual, and to the point of training and to the recommendation. I do think I agree with the days, and I'm assuming it was a suspension, or what was the 4 days? No one said. Was it 4 day suspension? And I don't know what the policy manual says for the, because I haven't gone through the training for the Metro Police Department, but I do not think 4 days is punitive. I think it could be 5 days. I think it could be a week. The question that I have in this case, because I have been employment attorney for over 2 decades, the question that I have is that when they're suspended, is it with or without pay?
Yeah, I think the suspensions here is maybe allow them to use their vacation.
For paid time? Yeah. Okay. So I don't think that, you know, I think anywhere from 3 to 5 days might be appropriate in this situation. And I don't think that's punitive for this type of violation and based upon the circumstances in which it occurred.
I will say, and I don't disagree with you, but I think where the 4 came from was the grid, the disciplinary grid, which is MNPD's disciplinary grid.
Thank you.
Is right there. And this is a category D violation. It's a first offense. The officer did not have any relevant disciplinary history. So underneath,
I always tell companies, municipalities, whoever, follow your own policy. So it needs to be 4.
that, and I will say that is if the board restricts the finding to only discourtesy, because that was the one that we had recommended sustaining. If you actually, conduct unbecoming was also recommended sustained. So if you add that in, give me one moment.
So initially it was the category F.
Yeah, and conduct unbecoming varies by the severity of the violation. So the board could find that as a first offense of a category D, or it could go higher. And the suspension days, I will say, always run consecutive. Trying not to sound like a defense
So 2
attorney.
recommendations in which we found are sustained, they were both category Ds.
One was a D, so the discourtesy is a D. Oh, sorry, so I apologize.
Okay, so I think we're still in the 1 to 4 day suspension. I still think, you know, and the question is whether it's a formal counsel or the oral reprimand. And, you know, in this situation, I would suggest it be a formal counseling based upon the facts of the case.
speaking out of order, but to help things along, I'm comfortable with 4 after listening to my fellow board members' comments.
Thank you. Member Wynn?
Yes, as I recall, when we had this discussion back in December, I asked Commander Laura to tell me about the training on trauma, and I think I had asked bias as well. So I want to say a couple of things about this. If you're looking at behavior inside the police department, this kind of absence of empathy might not seem as a violation if everybody's doing it. If that makes any sense. So training is supposed to correct attitude and behavior. Trauma training is very new to law enforcement. It's 2 parts. The first responding officer, they have to be trauma informed. The secondary interviews, I'm talking about sex assault, with a detective happens to be much more trauma informed, as Walter said. You got a more intense investigation. You have to train to this. This has to be not just a training for specialized units. It has to be trained from the chief all the way down to every dispatcher on the police department. Everybody has to understand that if we don't understand trauma, that produces bias. It's sort of at the core of what's going on with Memphis right now. They're in a class action lawsuit, which they are not going to win, of a group of women who were raped, whose suspect DNA was in the rape kits, but someone made a biased decision not to test the kits. So those rapists went on to rape multiple other women when the evidence was in the possession of the police department. That's happened in a lot of places. Detroit, Cleveland, New Orleans, San Francisco. So all this is new. When I asked Commander Laura about the trauma training, he gave me bits and pieces of this and that. That's not an answer. There's got to be a change inside the training philosophy at the police department to deal with trauma, and then secondarily, I think, to deal with bias, because it's directly connected to our use of force report, I believe. We can talk about it when we have the discussion. So when we're judging these officers for what they did or didn't do, my question always is, how are they trained? You rise to the level of your training. Some people are naturally empathic, some aren't. But if you're trained to do it and you don't do it, then the chief and the command staff has an avenue to correct you and punish you because of something you were trained to do. So I want to put that on the table before we make a decision on this. The policy recommendations, I think, from the board should be if they're interested in trauma curriculums, there's a bunch of them out there that are being trained by all the major police organizations. And if they're not doing it, you're going to see more of this, where our natural instinct is to say, why didn't you slow down and be more victim-centered and trauma-informed? We're going to see more of this because they're not trained to it. So I think we should eventually, I think we probably will with the sexual misconduct piece, which is not just being empathic and sensitive to rape victims, is having a standard of not raping your own employees. That's basically what we're talking about here. So if we could get the police department to agree that they'll review and implement trauma training for their officers, a lot of this will be cleared up. That makes any sense?
It does, and I'm going to come back to you. But before then, we're going to hear from Member Spencer.
Thank you, Chad. So when I think about this case, I think about 2 things. And I think the first thing goes down to however we think of this officer and what happened here, it's around this officer's actions. That's basically what we're focusing on here. And to me, especially when I think about this after we've had a little bit of time, I think that there's no way that I cannot have some sort of recommendation that's according to this guy. And in reality, I still do think that that what we should recommend should be some combination of a longer suspension with some sort of training, formalized training. And I would like for us to, potentially as a body, as an organization, to help select or offer up options of particular trainings around trauma, trauma-informed care, and how to respond to different situations generally. And then also just trying to figure out how do you respond to any sort of survivor. Because I think if we're seeing this failure play out in this instance, there's also so many other instances where this kind of failure could be playing out. So this is just in one particular instance around someone who was a victim of sexual assault. And I just think there's so many other things that a police officer is probably going to be able to see and be privy to that we have to have some kind of stronger grounding when it comes to how officers are educated and how they're actually working out in the field. And with that, I kind of come to the second thing that I think about, which is this training piece itself. And that the department, really, I feel more strongly that I would like for the chief to either come down or to write a letter talking to the community at large around what this training looks like. We shouldn't necessarily be having to kind of piece it out of anyone. This is not a very political sort of situation. It is just one on like how we're treating people. And how we're treating the victims of sexual assault, especially. And so I think what I would like to include in part of a resolution is that the chief and the department comes forward and directly outlines what their training is. And then from that point, perhaps in the meeting, that we can engage on, okay, where are some areas in which we could probably improve upon something, build something new, and adapt it to make sure that we have a better system that doesn't let this happen again. Because I think we're all in consensus that it feels like training just really went out the blue somewhere. Like this officer just did not grasp some level of empathy, some level of concern, and integrated that into how, quote unquote, he was supposed to be doing his job. And so I think that we really need to be focusing on still admitting what happened here between officer and between this person, as well as trying to push the department to come up with better policies and to bring more ideas around the kinds of training that they can receive.
Member Beard.
I just wanted to go back to my comment. I was responding to Boardman Goddard's comment about, 4 days okay if trained and 4 days okay if not trained. I was just commenting as to the days, but I definitely agree about the caveat for the training.
Okay.
So I just didn't address that I don't think I addressed that when I spoke initially, but all employees need appropriate training to do their jobs appropriately. And if you don't have the appropriate training, then we do need to think about what that recommendation would look like.
Thank you. Member Brown, did you have a comment? Okay.
You had to have.
As I recall, the victim in this case, she was never interviewed, or we never got any input from the actual victim. That was kind of my recollection, because the complainant in this case obviously was very upset about what she thought was mistreatment, although it looks like she embellished her story a little bit about saying the officer dragged the victim by her armpits. It turned out that was medical personnel. So, and it's pretty clear the officer got aggravated because he felt like, she was what legal term is interficious intermeddler, that she was telling him to do his job. And I think that does become somewhat of a discourtesy. He should have handled it a little better. But what concerns me the most about reading through it is the fact he was interviewing the victim in more or less in the hallway. And that, to me, is part of the recommendation for training and such. And I think that does touch on a lack of professionalism and courtesy for the officer to do an interview of a potential rape victim in the hallway. That just sets my teeth on edge. But it seems to me we need to focus on, as best we can, because we didn't get any cooperation on the training, but a recommendation that specifically recommends that the police department conduct appropriate training in investigation and initial contact with victims of sexual assault or potential sexual assault. And because of the nature of the way he conducted them, I would think a suspension is in order, but we've been over 28 months on this, and I'm a little uncomfortable with a 4-day suspension. I would think a 1-day suspension on this with training for the officer and formal training by the police department for all officers that have contact with potential victims of sexual assault. We probably need to get this to some sort of a vote, because I think we could talk about it all night, but because it's a difficult case and it does bother you. But what bothers me is the interviewing and the nature of the interview in a hallway. That to me is very unprofessional and needs some discipline. But on the other hand, I think probably a lot of it is attributable to a lack of training, and apparently they did have someone there at the hospital that to work with the victim, but the officer's conduct, what as I say, bothers me the most is the interview and somewhat of a hostile interview in the hallway.
Member McCree.
I'll make a brief comment and then I'll move to a vote on this one. I've heard board member Wynn and Spencer talk a lot about the training and the bias, and that is absolutely needed. We can see the bias there. But I also want to address the cultural piece of the department, right? Like, even when training is implemented, if it is not a part of the culture of the department to act in a way that is empathetic to the folks that they face. I mean, even in the language, when you go through the classes, the community, it's called
Citizens.
There we go. The Citizens Review Academy. One of my concerns, even going through that program, was the language that they use for folks who were considered victims, who could have faced harm and trauma. And it was always in conversation, and the language they use, a them versus us, an elimination of the threat. There was never even language included in the culture of the department to be considerate of the folks who are facing the brunt of this harm. And so as we move into those conversations for the next administration, I think culture needs to be at the forefront of that conversation, and everything stems from that. And so I move for us to take a vote on a 4-day suspension with the specialized training considered for this officer.
Yes, please.
Can I amend this? This motion? Is that allowed? Or would you like to ask? Okay. I'll make a motion to amend on the basis that we also get strict guidelines on what sexual around like sexual assault training and what this kind of education and training already looks like from the department. I think that should be something that either, again, I feel pretty strongly around some sort of letter or some sort of statement in which they acknowledge that the department acknowledges the gravity of what's happened and also says, this is how we plan to work with the COB on trying to fix this issue.
Member Beard and then Member Wynn.
I don't know if we can do a second amendment. I defer to our attorney over there.
Turning in the Metro Council.
I stay in my lane, so I'm gonna let her tell me when I can make a second amendment. Can I make
Yeah,
one?
you can. I was
Okay.
gonna say, yeah. Just,
Okay, I think we have maybe some, we have different thoughts about the number of days. And I think what we could do, is just state that we believe it's a category D, and that requires 1 to 4 days suspension, and leave it within the discretion of the department to implement whatever days they choose, if they agree with our, recommendation. So.
Okay, let me
Judge
see
Brown-
here.
Judge Brown said 1 day. I think, we initially said.
But the
4
vote
days.
is for 4 days.
I
And
know,
so-
I'm trying to amend it to say not
I
4
got you.
days, but to say that we would just follow the policy that is a 1 to 4 day suspension.
Well, it sounds like that would be a different vote though, right? It would be a different motion because now it'll go from 4 days to 1 to 4 days.
yeah, so there'll be a
It's
motion
supposed to be a friendly
substitute.
amendment.
It'll be substituting the original motion.
Right. So,
4 days.
that's the original request.
They had 2 different sustained violations.
Right.
I would consider that a different motion. It is. I would consider that a different motion because it's going from 4 days to 1 to 4 days. So what's on the floor is a 4-day suspension with really what the director has suggested, her recommendation. That is it. And then Member Spencer says amendment to that, she would like to attach, say it again, training.
Training, and that the department has to come forward with what exactly the training standards are right now, and that they pledge to work with us on this.
Okay.
If it's legal, your secretary would beg you to have 2 different votes, one on
Yes,
days
we
and one
will.
on, okay.
That's where I was getting at. Member Turner.
Yes, I just wanted to clarify. I think I kind of agree with Member Garber that we have 2 separate votes. One for the training to call the department to give information, to outline their training on trauma and how to handle sexual assault victims, and then a separate vote for what Member McCray, I saw it, to talk about, to hold what the executive director has stated in the beginning, 4 days, with formal counseling. And I just said, I do agree with the comments of, it is a cultural thing. We do need to make sure on a larger scale, deal with this individual officer, this incident first. But we do need to definitely call the chief and the whole department to say, hey, let's dive in a little bit deeper to see what are you training about, and to see and to have training for all the officers, and kind of push that agenda and push that to be something that they do now and in the near future, to make that a part of their culture. So that's my recommendation on that.
So let me get this straight. We have the director's recommendation as the motion. We want to now separate the training motion to have its own vote. And then my recommendation is to attach with the inquiry of training that's already happening with MNPD, that we recommend that all MNPD officers attend or participate in trauma training in regard to sexual assault and misconduct of victims as well.
I just wanted to jump in really quick because in terms of the 4 days, that conduct unbecoming can be any category. So if the board feels strongly that they want to go over 4, the board is what chose, well, at the director's recommendation, to set it as a D. But the board could say, and I'm not trying to steer you, but it could be an F, it could be an A, it could literally be any, it is not set by policy. So the board can say, based on the severity, we want it, classify this as such. I just wanted to let you know if there was.
Let me go to Member Nguyen, then Member Goddard.
Sorry, my comment was about the training vote. If it can wait before we vote on that, I just had one thing I wanted to recommend before we voted on that. So I can wait until we vote on the disciplinary action and then have additional comment on the training.
Okay, and so we'll take up the vote for training right after the conduct.
Responding to Member Beard, we have a long history of picking the category and picking specific days. Most of the time, we simply confirm what we agree with, don't have an issue with what has been recommended. I would not want to start giving that discretion to the chief unless we have very unusual circumstances that make that somehow different. Thank you.
I withdraw my amendment, or whatever it was.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Beard. Member Holloway?
I would take a second on that motion she got on the floor.
All right, we now have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? All right, motion carries. All right. So now we will, okay, go ahead.
So to make sure I'm documenting that right, that was accepting the original
That is correct.
recommendation, which is
That is
counseling
correct.
plus 4 days.
That is right.
Thank you all.
Now we have a motion on the floor for training. And so, Member Spencer, could you restate that? And then we will go to Member Nguyen.
So my motion is that MNPD should come out with all of their guidelines around sexual assault training and sexual misconduct training just from the jump, and that they should acknowledge the gravity of the situation and basically say that they want to work with us to improve their trainings and improve these guidelines and make sure that something like this does not happen again. As well as I think you amended a little bit as well to say that all officers are going to go through that set improved training.
So this is the work that I do.
Yep.
So the last police department that I worked with was Philadelphia. And we did, through the Justice Department, an assessment of response, investigation, and prevention of interpersonal violence of the Philadelphia Police Department. Part of the assessment with the command staff was to give them an instrument so they could self-assess themselves to the national standard for all kinds of crimes, with all kinds of issues like bias, trauma, discrimination, culture, misconceptions about crimes committed mostly against women. Men can be victims of rape as well. And after we did the assessment with Philadelphia, they agreed, and then a group of us went back and we trained 500 of their first-line sergeants and lieutenants who were then to monitor the behavior of their officers, like this officer on the response to this sex assault. So I would like to recommend, and I'll do this after the meeting, I can send out to all of you all the gender-based violence self-assessment and community assessment protocol that we created for this particular kind of issue to all of you all to look at, to decide whether it's complete enough. Then the board can send it on to the chief and the command staff for all commanders in the Metro Police Department to take their self-assessment on these issues around trauma and bias, sex assault, child abuse, elder abuse, human trafficking, stalking, all the interpersonal violence crimes, to see where they are. And then once they make that assessment, then we can go back with some suggestions on trainings to fill the gaps of where they're not training their officers. The obvious ones are going to be bias and trauma. But there's other things, too, that you want to train to. But it also, in the assessment, it also talks about your arrest decisions, how you make arrest decisions, which is a real problem when you're looking at bias in policing. It's in the gender-based violence assessment. So 2 things. I'll send all of you the GBV assessment that you can look at yourself, but I'd like to recommend that it be sent forwarded officially to the Metro Police Department for all their commanders to take. Because if we just ask them, do some training on bias or trauma, we want them to pick the very best courses and trainings that's available that necessitates, right, the task of preventing any of this happening again, of not being victim-centered, trauma-informed with any crime victim. So those are my 2 things. I'll send you the assessments so all of you can review it. And then my recommendation would be, if we're going to offer them training, ask them to assess themselves first before they set time aside where maybe we as a board can sit down and say, here are recommendations on your training based on citizen complaints. So now we bring the citizen's voice into the decision-making on the curriculum for the academy for the recruits and their in-service training.
Awesome. Member Holloway?
We seem to always get back to the point of what kind of training they got, how they got training. Let me say this. We got some of the best training in the country. And even though we get training each year, it was just a bad decision made by that officer. He misrepresented the victim. That's point blank. If she had been a church-going girl, the attitude would have been much different. And I don't think the police department here in Nashville falls short of their training because they got very good training. I put our training against any training in the country. And we always get back to the point of training. We get the training, it depends on how the officer display himself on the scene.
Member Spencer?
I think in this instance, what I'm really particularly interested in is what they already have on the books. Because for an organization that has already been in existence for so long, we should already have some idea of some sort of standard and some sort of protocol. This is an example of where that protocol was not followed. And if we haven't been able from the time that we started this investigation to get a clear, succinct, maybe not succinct, but clear, precise answer as to what those standards are, I think that raises a lot of concerns for a number of other issues. I think from what your comments were talking about, it really talks about, if this is what's going on in this kind of instance, just in this one isolated incident, I'm not going to say isolated incident, let me scratch that, but in this one incident that we're looking at right now, that there's potentially more incidents that we just don't know about. So what is actually going on? And so I think for me, we come back to the training piece, because if this is what we're seeing when someone, and again, mind you, that's not the person that was suffering from this sexual assault, that was trying to recover from this. This was the advocate. And so it's like she was that concerned. And so I think about, when I think about this situation, I think about so many caseworkers, so many people that are dealing with folks day to day on a day-to-day basis, out on the streets. And thinking about how they're also processing this and how they're also seeing this. And so I think when it comes to training, what the very least that the department should be able to do, and I think the very least that we as an organization should be able to do, is to say, from jump, tell us what you already have. And I think that's a point from which we can say, like, okay, let's work deeper on like their own assessment, and like let's get more things and more pieces out of it. And I think that can also definitely be part of a larger conversation. For me, and I would assume what would be really critical for everyone, not just the people that are watching, but just everyone in the city, is just we should deserve to know what their policies are, what their standards are. And I think at the very least is what they can do is just tell us. And at that point, then we start the conversation, and I think that's when we start following up and being like, okay, this is what you have. Then we could read the materials that you're talking about, and then from what they already say that they have, the standards that they already say that they are using, see what's working, see what's meshing, and then move forward on that end.
Member McCree?
I think that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, as you said, we all sat in a meeting where a couple of months ago, Commander Laura said there were general trainings. They should be able to show us those trainings. That's a non-starter. I would also like to second your motion and move for a vote.
Okay. Before we take that vote, Member Wynn, did you have something that you wanted to?
No, I just wanted to make the comment about training one last time.
Okay.
Training is perishable. That's why the state requires police to requalify with their firearms every year. If they didn't, we'd have a lot of accidental discharges and a lot of innocent people shot. No matter how well your police department's trained, you've got to get back into the classroom and teach these kinds of perishable skills. It's got to happen. And if you want to look at police departments who didn't decide to train, I can show you the patterns and practice findings from the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department on Steubenville, on Cleveland, on Baltimore, on Philadelphia, on Phoenix, now on Louisville, and now soon to be the Memphis Police Department. And what all of these findings bring out is 4 basic things. You're not training, you're not disciplining, you're not administering, and you're not, you don't have a policy on those issues. So even modern policing has to be retrained over and over again. I know how well the Metro Police Department's trained. I taught at the academy for years, but that was yesterday. And all bets are off now. You're right, Member Spencer, they should tell us, they should be in this room saying, here's our schedule for training on recruits, on specialized, on in-service, on every one of these topics. They should be bragging about their thoroughness in their training. That if you've got a thorough training curriculum, you don't hide it. You show it to the public and you show it to the taxpayers. So I want to make sure we're clear about that. That even though we got a great police department, everybody needs to be trained.
All right.
Can you tell me the name of the Department of Justice Self-Assessment?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Gender-based violence.
The gender-based violence assessment was created by the International Association of Chiefs of Police under a federal project, and I was involved in it. We had 12 national police departments where a team of us went in and completely deconstructed the agency. We interviewed their academy instructors, we interviewed their investigators, we interviewed the chiefs, we talked to the advocates in the community. And from those 12 assessments, and the police departments were paid, they got $250,000 per department to do this. They decided, or they agreed to implement all of the things that we recommended, all the changes, from how you select your personnel, how do you punish your personnel, how you train your personnel, how do you administer your personnel. So from those 12 agencies, we then created this master assessment that now police departments are using across the country. So it's on the IECP website. I'll send you a link to it so you can see this. It's called the GBV Agency Self-Assessment. And that's gender-based violence.
Sarah, did you want to?
I just want to make sure, I knew we had a second on the motion. If we could just clarify what the original motion is, so that way sorry, that way we can, it's fine.
Got a little wild here. And so the original, so what we said that we were going to create as a second vote was regarding training. And Member Spencer asked if we would receive or request from MMPD all of their guidelines for sexual assault for all officers. And so essentially, what have they been doing up until this point? But in conjunction with that, what I understood was a continuation of the motion from Member Wynn that he will send us the GVB, gender-based violence self-assessment, for the board to review. After review, we will then send the assessment, self-assessment, to MMPD, the chief, who will have all commanders conduct the self-assessment, And when we receive the results of the self-assessment, then we will be able to recommend policies or training material that is appropriate for MNPD. Did I say that correctly?
Oh, that's really well done.
Okay, thank you.
You got it right. Command staff.
Same difference. We got it. Was that it? That is the motion. And we had a second. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, you abstain, Joe? Okay. Okay. Thank you, Member Brown. Okay, the motion carries. That's okay. It is. I got you. I was just being facetious. Okay. So that motion carries. We are good. Okay. All right. Let's go to the next PRI.
All right, and I'm gonna move along here because we're short on time. Both of the second ones are a little bit fact intensive, so I'm gonna go to CC 2022-028, and the original complaint stems from May 27th, 2022. The complainant reported that MNPD failed to assist her on May 19th, 2022, when she called 911 in reference to her missing 16-year-old daughter. Essentially, the complainant said that at 1:10 a.m. she called 911 to report that her missing daughter, who is a juvenile, that her iPhone was pinging from a location at a specific address in Antioch, Tennessee, which is within Davidson County. The complainant advised 911 that her child was already on the NCIC missing children's list that the complainant had observed 2 days earlier on her home surveillance system. She had seen her daughter get into a black Dodge Charger or similar type sports car, that she did not know the identity of the car's owner, but believed based on previous statements from her daughter that it was a black male aged 27 to 30. She further advised dispatch that her daughter was prostituting herself with this individual and that the complainant was trying to transport her minor daughter to a deposition in Rutherford County later that morning to give testimony about a different man who had previously allegedly raped her daughter on a previous occasion. Going forward to the findings of fact, well, before that, the policies we looked at were deficient or inefficient performance of duties as to juvenile runaway procedures, also the criteria for calling out support units, specifically youth services and missing persons, and also honesty, truthfulness, and courtesy. So, in terms of the facts, this is after reviewing the body cam and interviewing 2 of the officers. The third declined. On May 19th, 2022, at approximately 1:10 a.m., complainant called 911. 911 recordings show that she reported that her 16-year-old daughter was on the NCIC list, that she had come to a specific address in Antioch, Tennessee, with a grown man who was in his late 20s or early 30s, that her minor child had been with this man for at least 2 days, and that the complainant, when she followed the iPhone tracker to that specific address, recognized the vehicle, or that it was a match for the vehicle she had seen at the address on her surveillance system. She further told 911 that the minor had a deposition against the man who had previously raped her later that morning, and that her minor daughter had been engaged and was currently engaged in prostitution, specifically with adult men. The complainant called 911 4 times between 1:10 a.m. and 2:44 a.m. before officers arrived. The first officer arrived at approximately 3:17. The second one arrived at about 3:19. I will add that they dispatched only after the 4th 911 call, which was also the one where the complainant said that she was honking her horn and going to start knocking on the door of this residence, which was at approximately 2:45 a.m. It was only at that point that the officers actually dispatched. Body-worn camera shows Officer 1 en route to the location, saying that he was attempting to locate a possible 75, which is a missing person. He stated that the girl was 18 years old, which is just kind of strange because the child was already said to be on the NCIC list and was a minor. Officer 1 and Officer 2 arrive, like I said, pretty close in time, and together they approached the complainant's vehicle. So she was sitting in a parked car outside of this house where she thought her daughter was. She states to both of the officers at that time, quote, "My daughter is 16 and she's at that house and she's been gone for a couple days with this man. I don't know who he is, but that black car picked her up from my house. I want him arrested and everybody in there needs to be arrested," and keeps going on. Officer 1 asked the complainant how she knew that her daughter was in the house. The complainant replied that she had tracked her daughter's iPhone to that location, and that at approximately 2:53 p.m., her daughter had stopped sharing her location. So the complainant was no longer able to see where the phone was. Body-worn camera showed that neither officer made any attempt to look at the complainant's iPhone to view that tracking information. Officer 1 responded by asking the complainant how she knew her daughter was in the house against her will. The complainant stated she did not know that, but that her daughter was 16 years old and the man was about 30 years old. She repeated to the officers that she had been tracking the phone for days, had saw it go all over, including up to Hendersonville and downtown. She advised the officers that she had not seen the driver of the vehicle on the camera, but that there was camera footage of her daughter getting into the car. Neither officer ever asked to see that footage or if it was available. Officer 2 offered to make contact with the residents of the house. Before they walked away to do that, the complainant asked if they wanted to see a picture of the child. At that point, neither officer had asked to see one or had asked for any identifying information. And in response to that offer, Officer 2 responded, "Yeah, if you want, that works." The two officers approached the residence to perform a knock and talk. An adult male answers the front door. They asked him if the child was there or if there was a younger looking female in the house. He stated that he had not seen such a person. He explained to the officer that he had two roommates, one of whom he said that he seldom saw them when he got home from work because they were usually asleep. He told the officers that one of the roommates was asleep at that time and one of the other ones was away at their girlfriend's house. Officer 1 asked who drove the Charger or similar vehicle parked in the driveway. The resident confirmed that that vehicle did belong to his roommate who was present in the house and was asleep at that time. The officers sort of half-heartedly asked to speak to that roommate. The resident goes in and then returns several minutes later and says that the gentleman was still asleep and he didn't want to wake him up, but that he did look in the room and did not see anyone in the room with that gentleman. The officers advise him to basically, they're looking for a missing child and to let them know if they hear anything. While they're walking back to the complainant's car, Officer 2 says to Officer 1, quote, "I'm not going to go off of a phone or Apple ping. I know they're pretty accurate, but I don't see me having any right to get into the house or get a search warrant." At that point, Officer 2 got into his patrol vehicle and called Sergeant 1, and related sort of what was going on. The two officers then went back to the complainant's vehicle and advised her that they could not make entry into the house. Officer 2 explained that they would need a search warrant to make entry and that they did not know if the minor was in the house aside from the iPhone tracking app. Officer 1 added that a search warrant would never be granted, and Officer 2 at that point advised complainant the next day to go through either Laverne Police, which is where the family lived, or to contact the MNPD Youth Services Division. The complainant at that point advised the officers that her minor daughter was already on the NCIC missing children's list, that she has missed 17 days of school and has been severely sexually abused and is prostituting herself. At approximately 3:42 a.m., Officer 2 states that they could call youth services, but that it, quote, doesn't qualify for a call out. Officer 2 repeats that the minor got into the vehicle with the adult willingly, to which Officer 1 agrees. At approximately 3:50 a.m., the complainant starts blasting her car horn and approaches the house where she thinks the girl is and begins banging on the front door. Officers approach her and ask her to go back to her vehicle. Sergeant 1 arrives at 3:55 a.m. Officer 2 and Officer 1 kind of recap to him accurately everything that has happened. Sergeant 1 then approaches the complainant's vehicle to speak with her, and she advises Sergeant 1, quote, I tracked my 16-year-old. Well, I'll tell you. She says the same thing she's already said to the other officers, and they continue to speak. Sergeant 1 tells complainant that since she had originally filed the NCIC report in Laverne, that only Laverne has jurisdiction, and since the car picked her minor daughter up in Laverne, that Laverne police and not Nashville would have to get the search warrant. Complainant repeats to Sergeant 1 that the minor is engaged in prostitution, that she had previously been taken over state lines for sexual purposes, and that the Laverne detective has this information as well. Eventually, Sergeant 1 calls the Laverne Police Department and asks to speak to a detective. Dispatch informs Sergeant 1 that they are familiar with the case and with the juvenile, that the detective is not in, and asks if it's urgent. Sergeant 1 states that it is not an urgent issue right now and proceeds to leave a voicemail for the detective. And I'll add, just as a side note, that detective does appear to be one of the ones who was dismissed as part of the Laverne, the scandal with the Laverne police recently. Body-worn camera further shows Sergeant 1 telling the complainant that he will return to the home to go knock on the door again after she asked him to do so. So he tells her, okay, I'll go up again and try to talk to them. On his way to do so, though, Sergeant 1 discusses that with Officer 1 and Officer 2, who essentially talk him out of it by recounting their interaction with the resident. Sergeant 1 then changes his mind, telling the two officers, basically, you've already done this. He returns to the complainant's car and tells her he will not be making contact with the resident, and that the best thing for her to do is go home and contact the Laverne detective in the morning. He tells her there's nothing that him or the other officers can do, and that they need, I think his exact words are, something more concrete in terms of evidence to get a search warrant, and that the phone tracker and the other corroborating information is not enough. At that point, complainant tries to get the officers to charge the men in the house for having her phone, basically saying, well, we know if my phone is in the house, then it must be stolen. The officers decline to do that and tell her, Sergeant 1 tells her basically that she can do that in the morning as well. The interaction lasts until about 4:30 a.m. When the complainant, at the repeated direction of the officers, leaves the scene and drives away. In terms of the policy issues, we first looked at this under deficient or inefficient performance of duties, specifically as to MNPD policy 15.60.10E, which defines missing persons, MNPD policy 1560.60, 1560.20, which are all related to the missing persons provisions. During her initial call to 911, the complainant informed dispatch that her daughter was a minor runaway, that she was on the NCIC list and she was with an adult male. Further, that she was and had been and was currently engaged in prostitution. Officer 1, Officer 2, and Sergeant 1 were all aware of the minor's age and status as a runaway. This information was sufficient to trigger investigation under 1560.020 for a missing person, since the minor was unemancipated and had left her residence without the consent of a parent. Officer 1 and Officer 2, during the interaction, appear to put a lot of weight on the fact that the minor had left and gotten into the vehicle with an adult willingly and voluntarily. That fact is completely and utterly irrelevant. Under MNPD policy 1560.60, it does not matter if the juvenile has consented, but if their parent or guardian consents. In this case, the complainant, who was the minor's mother, did not consent to her being with that adult and had clearly communicated that to the police. The minor was unquestionably a missing person under MNPD policy. The complainant tracked the minor to the address with an iPhone tracking app. Officer 1, Officer 2 did not make any further inquiry into that information or ask to see the app. They did not ask to see the video the complainant said she had of the minor getting into the vehicle, which could have provided other information such as the tags or other identifying features on the car. The officers did not ask to see the text between the complainant and her minor daughter. Those were significant because the complainant said that at the time the daughter deactivated the tracker, that was right after, and I mean minutes after, the complainant mother had been banging on the door of the house. So that could be taken as corroboration that was done in response to her presence at the house. The officers never asked to see those texts. really didn't make any inquiry when they were at the house, other than asking if the minor was inside. They never secured any identifying information about the man who answered the door or the other residents in the house, never got anyone's names or anything like that. Finally, Officers 1, 2, and Sergeant 1 failed to make a necessary call out for support services. Under MMPD policy, an employee is to request the response of appropriate support in the case of a juvenile when, quote, there is some apparent risk of or adverse condition. And under 1510.05, an investigator shall be notified when no one from Youth Services is on duty for any missing juvenile who is a number of factors, but any missing juvenile whose absence is caused by foul play, suspicious circumstances, or is at risk or in danger for some other reason. The officers never made a call to Youth Services, despite the obvious sort of urgency of the situation as far as complainant said. The complainant alleged that her minor daughter had been with an adult man without her consent. She told the officers clearly and repeatedly that the girl had a history of severe sexual abuse and had and was engaged in prostitution. That should have qualified as an apparent risk or adverse condition and was sufficient to trigger the officers to call Youth Services Division, even though they were not on duty. The other policy book that was discourtesy. We did not think that the officers were discourteous. They were polite and talkative with the complainant. Based on all of that information, by a preponderance of the evidence reviewed, the executive director concludes that the allegation of honesty, truthfulness, and discourtesy should not be sustained. By a preponderance of the evidence, the executive director concludes the allegation of deficient or inefficient performance of duties against Officer 1, Officer 2, and Sergeant 1 should be sustained. In terms of the recommended action, Officer 1 had prior 4 Category D offenses that resulted in a total 5-day suspension within the retention period. Officer 2 did not have, and as a result of that, the executive director recommends as to Officer 1 a 2-day suspension as a Category F offense. Officer 2 did not have any prior disciplinary history, according to the records provided. In their case, the executive director recommends formal counseling for deficient performance of duties as a Category F offense. Sergeant 1 also similarly had no relevant disciplinary history within the retention period. The executive director recommends formal counseling for deficient performance of duties as a Category F. That is all.
Questions or comments? Member Brown.
This case bothers me. With all due respect, I think very clearly the officers had probable cause for a search warrant. They just didn't want to do it. And they're totally failing to look at the evidence and follow through, to me, is a very clear violation. I'm a little curious as to the recommendation. We've got a 2-day recommended suspension for someone that's got 4 prior violations. In the last case, we went with a 4-day suspension for somebody that had no prior violations. I'm puzzled as to why the executive director only recommended 4 days. It seems to me that officer has had problems before, and it looks like he was kind of the lead person in this until the sergeant got there. But I would think he should be looking at more than 4 days for the first officer and 2 days for the others. As I said, they just didn't want to do much, and they clearly could have gotten a search warrant. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
I would say, just for context, that we didn't discuss that part a whole lot because we were rushing to get this one done, so the board should not at all feel bound by that recommendation. One thing I wanted to mention, which I did not, and I think is important because this is a missing child, is that the complainant was black, the child was black. The first 2 responding officers were white, and the sergeant was black. But I do think that is, I think that is a relevant fact, so I wanted to include that.
Right. This recommendation came in, and I personally, as I looked at this, a 2-day suspension. Can you tell me about the four category Ds? This recommendation should be increased. I'll give you the autonomy to increase it, but I would make a recommendation that would move this up based on what those others sustained, the 5-day suspension is, but just based on what happened, and I talked to the complainant myself, this would have been, for me, we should have had it as a category D offense. And it should be, in my opinion, it should be at least a 4-day suspension under the category D for the retention period of 36 months.
And just really quickly to that, this is in as a category F, but inefficient or deficient performance is also varies by offense, so you can go up the range on that one. Yeah.
Member Spencer.
For me, looking through and listening through, I kind of have questions around the courtesy issue. So I'm fully in agreement with the allegation of deficient or inefficient performance of duties. However, as I read courtesy, and I particularly focus on the first sentence, where employees shall be courteous, civil, and respectful to all persons and make every effort to meet the needs of citizens requesting assistance, my curiosity isn't in necessarily that they didn't do exactly what she had said, but however, if it's also sustained that they didn't fully do their duty, then what she needed was for them to follow policies. So to me, as I interpret this and read this, that they were not being courteous in that regard because they weren't fully taking this seriously, and because they didn't follow through on what they were actually supposed to do. And so therefore, I think that we should also amend this to maybe have the allegation of honesty, truthfulness, and discourtesy be sustained, if there's agreement on that reasoning.
You like for the first honesty, truthfulness, and discourtesy to be sustained. So it would be changing the recommendation.
Yes.
And those are two different allegations. I would say that. And I certainly hear you. And in terms of the honesty and truthfulness, there's also an argument to be made there. I just thought we'd leave that to y'all.
And I'm open to also that being part of a question, because it's as I look through it and think through it, it's a definite curiosity that I have. And so from how I've been kind of processing it, it feels more so that should be sustained here. But I'm also open to, what are other people's thoughts on that line of reasoning?
Member Wynn, then Member McCree, then Member Holloway.
I would never challenge a federal judge's assessment of probable cause in a search warrant, considering federal judges sign thousands of search warrants. So I'm going to defer to Judge Brown on his probable cause assessment for this case. My question is, though, if the officers on the scene assess the call their immediate supervisor to the scene, that relinquished responsibility to that supervisor to handle this call correctly. When the sergeant didn't notify the detective and youth services who could have sorted this out with the assistance of an agency outside the county, that doesn't matter. Crime is a crime. You're responsible. How are we holding the officers responsible for this and not the sergeant?
I think that's a fair point. I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I just think that there were the Officer 1 and Officer 2 before Sergeant 1 got there ignored, appeared to try really hard to ignore any of the corroborative evidence that was in front of them. And when Sergeant 1 arrived there, he didn't speak to those residents at the door. He didn't do much. And so he was acting completely off of what Officer 1 and Officer 2 told him. So that is entirely your decision. I want to clarify that's kind of why it wasn't. He mostly spoke to the complainant.
But whatever that sergeant ordered to be done at the scene, they have an obligation to follow that order.
Correct.
if the sergeant clears the call and says there's no PC for a search, there's no suspicion that there's a missing child in this house, the mother had sat outside the house for hours. So the sergeant's assessment of the evidence was lacking.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what your is that what your assessment is?
Yes.
Then I'm having a hard time understanding why we're punishing the officers. If we do that, then the rank and file would say, I called my sergeant.
Mm-hmm.
That's with a difficult situation. That's what any well-trained officer would do, and not being punished instead of that. So it's just something.
What is contained in his disciplinary file. I think that's a fair, based on previous behaviors. But I do think that we should hold the sergeant accountable as well, more than a formal counseling, for sure. And you guys can talk about what that looks like. I mean, I can make my recommendation for that, but I'll let you have a discussion about it.
We will. Member McCree.
Thank you, Chair. This case is really problematic and really troubling to me for a number of reasons. But I'll start by saying that in the same way that you dismantle trust by what you do as a department, i.e. use of force and other things, you also erode that trust by what you don't do. And it's by showing up in communities of color 4 hours past the crime. It's about not showing up and not believing victims when they tell you what's going on. And we see a lot of that going on here. So let's start there. Secondly, we've seen several cases come before this board where we do punish the officers and we don't get to the supervisor, the commander, whoever's in charge. And the officers are bearing the brunt for negligent leadership. And so I recommend that whatever we do for the officers, which I think the 4-day, let's start there, but that the supervisor should at least, we should consider at least the 4 days for that supervisor as well. And so, yeah, I'll leave that there and I'll open that up to further conversation for the board.
Also, one more, Member Gardner was, Member Holloway.
In the first place, solving a lot of crime is when it's still hot. When they had a greater chance of getting that young lady at that location, it was still hot. She was still there. And for him to let the guy go in there and look himself and say, what, he gonna get his friend in trouble, saying that she's in there. I see with my own eye. I ain't not nobody else see for me. And they should have locked that down until they got a search warrant to the gone in the place. So whatever recommendation, for the officer and the sergeant, I feel is appropriate.
My recommendation for the sergeant would be a Category D offense with a 7-day suspension.
Member Wilson.
Yeah, I just want to, in reference to what Member Spencer was talking about, I just wanted to say that I wholeheartedly agree about the courtesy, and this particularly with the line that make every effort to meet the needs of citizens requesting assistance. So I definitely wanted to say that. One thing that also stands out to me is the fact that the sergeant told this mother what he was going to do and then reneged on it.
Yeah.
Came back and told her he was not going to do that after he had told her he was. So I just wanted to just point that, to name that.
I just wanted to add really quickly to that. What the previous point was, but in terms of asking, there's a whole exchange between the two of them where she asks him and specifically asks, you as a black man, can you please go speak with them? They are young black men. And so I just say that to say that was part of her specific request when asking for the second knock and talk was, can you please go tell these young men that they could end up in prison? Mm-hmm. And so he sort of agreed, but then backed off.
And also, I think the fact that we need to talk about they don't know what to do with an NCIC for a child in another county. Like they should someone should know that policy. I mean, a sergeant should know it.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, was that back to, yeah, and I think
Absolutely.
going to Member Holloway's point about the trail of evidence, the complainant raises to them several times during this encounter that, right now, I know that my daughter is in this house, or she was an hour ago. Once I leave this place, the tracker is switched off, and I will not, unless it comes back on, we will have no way to find this child. And so that was also something that was very, very clearly communicated to the officers and multiple times.
Member Turner.
Yeah, this is very, very problematic, disheartening to, to hear, read this case. And, from the previous case to this case, that this case is also a case of sexual abuse, as a minor. And I hope that what we are doing as a board to push, the training, making sure they're getting the training, making sure they are implementing the training that they do get. That I hope, from hearing these two cases back to back like this, it's like, is this department insensitive to sexual abuse, to victims of that? And I hope that's not the case, but it looks like it's the case. And so I again, only got two more meetings as board member, but so I wanted to just make that statement, and that of hearing these two cases side by side dealing with sexual abuse and that case, that it's kind of seemed like it's a pattern, a culture within the department that needs to be looked at. It needs to be the training needs to be pushed around this, because this is very serious case, and it just seems like it's very insensitive to these types of cases. And so I'll leave it right there. I got some more comments. Anyway, I'll leave it right there.
Thank you, Member Turner. Member Beard.
I agree with all my fellow board members about the horrific facts of this case. Do we know if the child has been found?
Yeah, I think it was 24 hours later, or yeah.
I believe she was.
Yeah.
She was not found during this incident. So.
Right.
I'm talking,
Yes.
after this incident.
After
She
this
was
incident,
found,
she
the
was.
child has been found. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, she was found. What it reminded me of, we recently heard a case of MMPD failing additional youth of color. I think it was at the previous meeting where the MMPD officers stated that they did not know the policy around juveniles. And I think this is becoming, now it's a pattern, right? Where we are, officers are being dispatched to scenes where youth are in need, or, they are, or a parent is asking for some type of assistance, a guardian is asking for some type of assistance, and they're not getting that assistance from MMPD. One time, okay, it's a mistake, an officer made a mistake. We continue to get these cases in front of us where MMPD is failing our youth. And I don't know how else to put it. I don't know what else to say. The mother gave them had all of the facts that she could provide to them, and then they rejected those facts. They rejected the evidence. She is outside of the door with stating that she had footage from her cameras outside of her house for the car that was in the driveway. That's a problem. That is a serious problem. And the officers had, ample opportunity to take this matter seriously, and they chose not to. So, one of my recommendations would be, looking at this intensely is if they need the youth services division to be 24 hours and it's a call involving a youth or a juvenile, then that's who should be dispatched to the scene. If we can't rely on the officers to know policies around juveniles and their rights and who has what say. And so I really want us to look at that and making sure that the citizens of Nashville, Davidson County have the proper representation when it comes to public safety. Remember when?
Yeah, on call is on call. You're on duty. You're just sleeping in your bed.
Okay,
I've done that a lot.
right.
You can't not respond when
That's
you're
right.
on call because you'll be in the sergeant's office.
That's right.
So that's one thing. And the detective could have sorted this out quickly. They'd work, this is their deal. They do them all the time. Runaways are part of their work.
That's right.
I can't vote for the discipline of these officers because I think the sergeant's responsible. Let me explain. And I hear what you say, Director Pitchford, about one of the officers' prior, record. It seems to me that because he's got that record, he's now trying to stay out of trouble. That's why he called the sergeant to the scene. I've seen officers who just continually got in trouble and which refused to call the sergeant and ask for help. That's a self-correcting error. It usually ends in dismissal or you're put in another position where you want to carry a gun. But when you've got somebody that's got a history, a discipline history, you have to consider when they make these moves where they say, I can't make a decision, I'm just going to defer to my sergeant calling the scene, then the sergeant assumes responsibility for everything after that. So that's just my consideration. Thank you.
Member Brown.
I understand Member Wynn's comment on it. I would still think that some discipline for the officers is appropriate. The sergeant was going to make go back in, and seems like they were pretty adamant in talking him out of it. So, having called the sergeant to make the decision, they then didn't accept his efforts to try to go in and talk him out of it. I would recommend that we approve the director's report with the change that Officer 1 get a 3-day suspension, Officer 2 get a 1-day, and the sergeant get a 5-day suspension. So I'll make that as a motion.
I'll second that.
Can you repeat the days?
3, 1, and 5. Sorry, I thought I have to speak louder.
Is it appropriate for discussion after the motion has been seconded?
I was gonna say, you can open it up for discussion if you know.
Perfect. Chair, can I be recognized? Yeah, I get what you're saying, Board Member Wynn. However, before we ever called higher office on scene, they were negligent to the request of this mother. We can acknowledge that it's a cultural thing. We can acknowledge and discipline higher staff in this instance, but they also have to face the consequences for the part that they played in this. And so that is the reason for my second. I believe that the higher sergeant here should face the bear of the brunt, which is why I agree with the 5 days for him. And just wanted to provide some context around my second.
All right, Member Spencer.
I don't know if I should make a motion around this, but I do want to return to my previous point around if we consider the courtesy, breaking that being sustained or unsustained, because I think for me that also adds into sort of a final sort of understanding and final sort of consequence around this.
And so you want the discourtesy to be sustained?
Yes.
Okay. So will we treat that as 2 separate motions?
I was gonna say, that'll be 2 separate motions.
Okay. All right. Member Gardner?
Just a clarifying question, Executive Director Fincher, are these floatings where they can have different letters? Are these violations floaters where they can have the different letters depending on where you plug it in? Because
Inefficient performance of duties, that's the floating one. Discourtesy is not. Discourtesy is category F.
Courtesy is F, and modesty and truthfulness is a double A.
Okay.
Right.
To get to 5 on the sergeant, do we need
On the
something other than
sergeant,
category F?
it's a category D.
D, okay, that's what we'll go with the motion.
Right.
Okay,
For the
thank you.
sergeant is it's a category. Did you want a category D? Did you two want the D category for the 3-day, or did you choose E? I was assuming all of them were category Ds.
I was
Easy
under the
days.
assumption when I seconded that this was a category D.
Okay, that's not good.
That's
Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
It would have to be a C to get to 5 for the sergeant.
Okay.
But I don't, yeah, but
Would
I
it
mean,
have to
that,
be a C or not a D? Because it goes. Oh, this is his first
because
event.
it's,
I'm sorry.
it's
I'm
his
sorry.
first offense, but I mean, that would also, that could be justified by member Wynn's point.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
got that
So we
information?
have a motion on the floor?
No, did you get the information that for the sergeant 5 days would be
Category C.
A category
Yep.
C.
We got it.
Got it.
She made a motion.
Okay, clarification. Did we just say the category for the sergeant is a C?
That is
A
correct.
C for 5 days.
And officers will be a D.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that's still around the deficient /
It's not
inefficient
the
performance.
discourtesy.
Right.
Right. So for the discourtesy,
I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna, you made a motion, Brown, second by member McCree. What's wrong?
Oh, she made the second, okay.
Oh, okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the motion carries. So we'll go to member Spencer.
Is there any more? Because I'll go ahead and make the motion. I'll make the motion to modify the conclusion around the discourtesy to sustained. Is that proper?
Is there a second?
I second.
So the motion is for the discourtesy allegation that is sustained by preponderance of the evidence and not unsustained as it was originally.
Okay.
Yes.
Category F.
Category.
Right, category F, but what is the punishment?
Formal counseling and oral reprimand, it
Okay.
looks like. And then, but for the second offense for Officer 1, it would be a written reprimand and a 2-day suspension. Or would it be the third offense?
have any discourtesies.
So
These are
it'd be
just
first.
about personal behavior. Right.
So it's the first one.
It would be his first offense.
Okay. So it'll be formal counseling or reprimand, member McCree.
Thank you.
Okay. And so the motion is to change it from not sustained to sustained for all 3 personnel of MMPD. Okay. Do I have a second? Member Whistle seconded the motion. All in favor? Any opposed? The motion carries. It is now changed to sustained, and it will be an oral reprimand or formal counseling.
Which one did you get? Oh, either one.
Yeah,
Okay. They're the same, basically.
yeah.
We were starting to vote without any discussion on the motion.
Would you like to discuss it now? And we are running up on 7:30, and I believe we have to be out of the building.
What time?
At 7:30,
To believe it's 7:30.
I will go very quickly then.
Okay.
This is D, PRR in case D 2021-005. This case was an audit of an investigation by MNPD's Office of Professional Accountability after they received a complaint from a member of the public that was a social media post and then some other emails which alleged that an officer, here Officer 1, wrongfully and unfairly arrested a juvenile for aggressive panhandling and used excessive force during the course of the arrest. The OPA cleared Officer 1 of any wrongdoing, and MNCO subsequently initiated an audit of that office's investigation. So, in terms of findings of fact, on March 28th, 2021, Officer 1 was traveling near 21st Avenue South, right near Vanderbilt campus, when he and another officer observed 3 male juveniles with signs requesting donations for fictitious sports teams. Officer 1 and the other officers attempted to make contact with juveniles. They apprehended child 1, who stopped running and was cooperative with them. They subsequently chased and apprehended child 3. That foot chase led them past the front of the Starbucks. Officer 1 apprehended child 3 and immediately noted that he smelled marijuana on the child's person. Officer 1 placed child 3 in handcuffs and walked child 3 back to the patrol car. Officer 1 asked child 3, quote, "Where's the weed?" To which child 3 responded that it was in his pocket. Officer 1 begins to physically rotate child 3 so that his chest is facing the patrol car. As Officer 1 continues to ask which pocket contains marijuana, Officer 1 and child 3 go back and forth about which pocket contains the weed. As Officer 1 begins sort of checking his pockets, child 3 at one point turns to present his front pant pocket to the officer, saying, "This one, I'm trying to turn so you can get it, bro." At that point, body cam shows Officer 1 engage in what he would later describe as an elbow pocket tactic, so the child's arms are behind his back. The officer places one arm through this area underneath the child's armpit. And then from the picture, he also has his foot up behind the child's foot so that the child is leaning, essentially pressed up against the side of the car, this limiting child 3's movement. Child 3 at that point does not appear to be physically resisting any of Officer 1's commands. Officer 1 pulls a bag of marijuana from the child's pant pocket along with other personal belongings. Officer 1 asks child 3 his name, his date of birth, which child 3 gives. Officer 1 then instructs child 3 that everything found in his pockets except for the marijuana will be returned to his parents, and tells child 3 he'll be charged with the marijuana. Officer 1 continues to check the back pockets of child 3, of his pants. At one point, sort of taps or lightly kicks the inside of the child's feet and tells him to, quote, "spread them." During this interaction, Officer 1 also advises child 3 that he's on camera, and while advising him of that, says, "smile," and that is during the pat-down. At this point, there is a group of female civilians who appear to be Vanderbilt students who are watching and filming this. They ask Officer 1 if he read the 2 minors who were at that point in custody their Miranda rights. Officer 1 tells the civilians 8 times by my count that he did not read the warnings because he hasn't asked the child any questions. The officer and those students get into a back and forth in which Officer 1 tells them that child 3 is going to be, quote, going to be taken to juvenile. And this begins to kind of escalate into an argument before Officer 1 walks away and goes back to his car. Officer 1 at that point helps child 1 and child 3 contact their parents or guardians to inform them of their whereabouts. At one point then, when he has the children in custody, Officer 1 holds up the bag of marijuana that was confiscated from child 3, kind of waves it in the air towards the college students and advises the college students that this was found in child 3's pocket. Officer 1 goes over to child 1, different one, and informs him that he needs to search him before he gets into the back of the patrol car and make sure he doesn't have any weapons. Officer 1 goes through child 1's pockets, pulls out a wad of bills and goes through them, asking him, quote, "You don't got no, like, dope wadded up in here. I'm not saying that you do. I'm just asking you a question, all right? That's all, because I don't like surprises." Officer 1 approaches the group of students again and says to them, quote, "So ladies, I want to start over, okay? First and foremost, I want to apologize for any misinformation y'all may have received if I came off as a dick earlier. I do wholeheartedly apologize." At that point, Officer 1 detached his body cam unit, turned it 180 degrees to face himself, and said, "I'm apologizing, just letting you know." Officer 1 then informed the college students about the children's previous panhandling incidents, explains why they were apprehended, and tells them that they are going to be taken to their homes. The two go back and forth into an argument that escalates about police brutality and officer-involved shootings and so on. At the end of that conversation, they take child 1 home. OPA opened their investigation into Officer 1 after receiving emails and Instagram posts. The OPA investigation was limited to MNPD policy 420.040, deportment and physical appearance, to wit 161020, prior to taking juveniles in custody. That rule basically just requires officers to determine whether the child is committing a delinquent offense or a status offense, and we'll get into that. MNPD OPA conducted an interview with Officer 1, reviewing the body cam footage. Officer 1 admitted that he probably should not have told child 3 he was going to juvenile, and said he would have handled the interaction with the young women better, specifically that he should not have shown them the bag of marijuana that was seized from child 3, and he should not have used the word dick in describing his actions. OPA recommended that Officer 1 be exonerated, stating that his actions were consistent with established policy. So getting on to our discussion, in terms of the one thing that OPA looked at, which was 420.040, we do not disagree. That should not be sustained. Officer 1 had probable cause based on prior interactions with the children and his personal observations that day that child 3 was engaged in panhandling. Personally observed an odor of marijuana coming from child 3. Moving on to the second allegation, which was honesty and truthfulness. Officer 1 advised the civilians when they were asking him about Miranda, and he says it repeatedly, and I think it's fair to describe it as somewhat aggressively, tells them over and over that he did not ask child 3 any questions, was not asking child 3 any questions, and therefore did not need to Mirandize him. Body-worn camera shows that Officer 1 did ask child 3 about where the marijuana was located, the child's name, his date of birth, and whether the minor was ever arrested before. These questions were investigatory in nature, and I have to jump over really quickly here. The questions about the weed, the location of the weed, were all investigative questions designed to elicit admissions relevant to child 3's guilt. Child 3 was handcuffed and undeniably in custody at the time. The onlookers correctly flagged this as a potential Miranda violation, but the officer responded by repeatedly and falsely asserting that child 3 was not and had not been questioned. These statements were further material within MNPD policy because they were given as justification for an official police action to a member of the public who was filming the encounter. Based on the officer's actions, such as telling child 3 to smile for the camera, pointing the camera at himself, the officer clearly understood that his actions were under scrutiny, and here we are talking about them. We therefore thought they were material within the meaning of the policy because they could affect the course of a, quote, investigation, official proceeding, or other inquiry. The fact that these assertions were made repeatedly and in a confrontational, sarcastic fashion compounds that violation. We also looked at his statements about how he handled the child, but we'll kind of get to that. MNPD policy, in terms of courtesy, profanity, and self-control, those were also likely sustained violations. MNPD policy 420.40 states that employees shall be courteous and civil and respectful to all persons. The officer's language, telling the child to smile for the camera, telling the child to spread them during a pat-down were discourteous, as was asking if he had dope in his pocket, waving the marijuana around to the onlookers to try to justify his own actions, showing evidence of a criminal offense. The argument that the officer got into with the onlookers appeared to violate MNPD policy 420.040, self-control, which states that employees shall not argue unnecessarily with a person or show a lack of self-control. Officer 1's arguments about the Miranda warnings, about officer-involved shootings and police brutality that had nothing to do with the incident at hand appeared to be a loss of self-control. And finally, in terms of profanity, the officer's use of the word dick when talking to a group of civilians, specifically a group of young women. That term being used by a male officer in that context was unquestionably sexual and vulgar and unacceptable. Deficient performance of duties was as to juvenile custodial interrogations of juveniles. The officer did not appear to follow that policy at all, did not get the required form signed. Finally, in terms of the officer's use of force, as to the handcuffing, it appeared to be reasonable. The child did give flight. He did run away from the officers, so use of handcuffs appeared to be within policy. The use of the elbow pocket technique also appeared to be justified or perhaps exonerated by policy, but I would leave that up to the board. Finally, as to the OPA's investigation, we found that OPA's investigation was severely deficient. First, they distorted the original statement of the complaint, which is described more in the report, but basically minimize the seriousness of the potential use of force by the officer. At one point, the director of OPA emailed another member of OPA staff saying that the photographs posted online, quote, looks Photoshop to me, end quote. The sergeant who led the OPA investigation attempted to speak with Child 3's mother, but she failed to show up. OPA did not attempt to contact any of the female onlookers, the child, and does not reflect any attempt by them to interview those individuals or the author of the Instagram post. Additionally, OPA did not interview or appear to interview any officers who were with Officer 1. There were 3 other officers there during the encounter who could have offered other insights or observations. They were simply never spoken to. And so rather than looking at any of these other policy violations, OPA pretty much only looked at, did the officers make a determination that the child had committed a delinquent offense or a juvenile status offense? That is the only policy that they looked at, which from our reading appeared to be grossly deficient response to the situation. Based on the preponderance of the evidence, the executive director concludes that the allegations of discourtesy, self-control, profanity, and deficient or inefficient performance of duties against Officer 1 should be sustained. The executive director concludes that the allegations of adherence to rules and policy as to taking juveniles into custody and use of force should be not sustained.
Any questions, any discussion? Is there a motion?
I move to approve the executive director's suggestions on this PRR.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right. All in favor? Aye. All right, the motion carries.
Can I make one question about that? I just wanted, in the copy that you guys got, the honesty and truthfulness one was in not sustained, but I put in that, because I think that was just a typo, to put that in to be sustained. And I just want to make sure that's correct.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In terms of recommended actions, review of Officer 1's disciplinary file reveals no relevant disciplinary violations within the retention period. The executive director recommends formal counseling for the discourtesy and profanity and a 4-day suspension for the self-control. The honesty and truthfulness is listed in the manual as a AA category offense, with the only corrective action being dismissal.
So we made the motion and it carried for the recommendation. We did. It's already approved. Okay.
Okay.
This was, I again want to say that it's for all of the media. These children appear to be very young.
Child 3 was 13. The other one was 8.
8. Member Brown.
Got to vote, but I do have an objection. We got a motion, a second, and we vote with no discussion. And I know
Go ahead,
it's late,
Member Brown.
It's late, but the procedure is that once you have a second, then you have discussion. You just don't run right to the vote.
Thank
We've
you,
done
Member
that-
Brown.
We've done that twice now.
Thank you. Go ahead. Did you have a comment? Do you have a comment? You said you had an objection.
My point was, we went motion, second, vote, and I was raising a paddle. when we
I
took
didn't
the
see it.
vote.
I
And
apologize.
so-
I didn't see
yeah,
your
I
paddle.
know we're late, and I know we're thing, but you've got to take an opportunity for discussion.
I hear you. Thank you.
Okay.
I asked if you wanted to talk about your objection.
Well, yeah, my concern was that I thought the officer certainly could have handled it better, and I don't have a problem with the findings, but on the other hand, it seems to me like the 4-day suspension was excessive. I would have voted for a 2-day suspension, but I think it's been voted on, and I'm not going to go back, but I just think we take an awful lot of time discussing things, and then when we kind of get down toward the end, we start rushing too much, and I think we need to just monitor our time a little bit more.
I agree. And I think with three, since we made a decision to have 3 PRRs, we may need to look at the time that we have the meeting. And so if the center is closing at 8 o'clock, then we have to be out of the building by 8 o'clock. Really before 8 o'clock. And so that's the problem that we're running into now. We're already behind schedule. So if we're going to continue to hear 3 PRRs, we may want to adjust the time on the front end of the meeting so we can have time to have some engaging discussion. So I think we will address that at our next meeting, and really at our executive committee meeting.
Or, Madam Chair, can we think about some more efficient processes during the time frame? Maybe limit comments to 2 minutes.
That's a good idea.
Or something of that nature, rather than extending the time of the meeting. So let's think, I'm just saying,
More creatively on
let's
it.
think about different options.
So maybe a 10-minute discussion versus a 30-minute discussion on a P.
PRR.
Also, there was
Yes.
one meeting where we did, special call meeting, we did 5 or 6, and Jill Executive Director Fincher did a great job of doing a shorter summary of the facts and
Right.
whatnot. If we will all commit to read these before we show up, I
That's
think that
right.
may shorten things
I
as
think
well.
so too. And then the summary will be, it's okay. But
As we had this meeting about the new board on October 22nd, going forward, we can talk about making some of these changes to our processes.
yeah, because I think so. Yeah.
So, I want to say this before we close. We didn't get to get to the fourth report.
We didn't.
And the second report. This one, we have to touch base we are, but we can email you where we are in that process so that you know, both of them, they're working simultaneously on getting them finalized.
Okay. And we did touch on a little bit of the presented. So we did touch a little bit on the use of force prior to of the meeting.
So, yes.
Finish your question.
So does the agenda item for our lead analyst's presentation have to be moved to be presented at the next meeting?
I was going to say, have someone move to postpone those.
The
for
use of
next-
force.
Yes.
For the
Advisory
next,
board.
So I
next
move
meeting.
to have the use of force.
Member Goddard, second. All in favor? Any opposed? All right, it carries, and we will discuss the use of force policy advisory report at the next meeting.
I also move to have new business or whatever else needs to be discussed.
New
to the
business
next
and
movement.
announcements. So 9 and 10. Second, Member Wetzel? All in favor? I can't hear you. All right. So those 2 items will be moved. This meeting is now adjourned.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.